The 1997 film Titanic stars a feisty lead character called Rose, who amazingly survives the terror and tragedy of the ill-fated ship. While the sinking of the Titanic was a true story, Rose was a fictional character. Believe it or not, there was actually a young woman aboard the ship whose true story is even more amazing than Rose's. Violet Jessop managed to cheat death no less than 4 times in her life, surviving a rough childhood as well as the tragedy of the Titanic and 2 other major ship disasters. It was actually the last of these disasters, not the sinking of the Titanic, which was the most terrifying and gruesome experience of her life. Starting with her rough childhood, Violet Jessop, born in Argentina in 1887, was the first of 9 children born to Irish immigrants William and Catherine. As children, Violet and her brother Ray suffered from the bacterial infection scarlet fever. While Violet managed to survive the illness, Ray was not so lucky and perished. Child mortality was a big problem back then. Of the 9 children William and Catherine Jessop had, only Violet and 5 others made it to adulthood. Violet's childhood experience of illness didn't end with scarlet fever. There was also a time when she was seriously unwell with a suspected case of tuberculosis, and miraculously made a full recovery despite the doctor's damning prognosis of almost certain death. In 1903, at 16 years of age, Violet lost her father due to complications arising from a surgical procedure. Now widowed, her mother Catherine decided to move Violet and her siblings to England, where Catherine worked for 5 years as a ship stewardess. Illness forced her mother to quit work by the time Violet was 21, so now this young lady, who had already gone through so much in her life, stepped up to fill the role of her mother as the provider for the family, becoming a ship stewardess herself in 1908. 3 years into her career, Violet found herself working on the RMS Olympic, a British ship which was both the most luxurious and largest ocean liner of the time. On the 20th of September 1911, during the 5th voyage of the ship, disaster struck. Just off the coast of Great Britain, along the Solent Strait, the Olympic had a collision with the front end of HMS Hawke, a British warship. To make matters worse, this front end, or bow as it's known, was equipped with a ram specifically designed for barging into and sinking enemy ships. The result was huge gaping damage down the side of the Olympic, and a great fright to all her crew and passengers, caused by both the thundering noise of the crash and also the shock of the impact. Luckily, no one lost their lives from the collision, and only minor injuries were suffered by a few on board both ships. Despite the significant damage, including a twisted propeller shaft and the flooding of 2 of its compartments, the Olympic didn't sink and was able to power itself back to Southampton for temporary repairs, before heading back to Belfast to be permanently fixed by the ship's builders, Harland and Wolff. The whole debacle was hugely costly to White Star Line, the owners of the Olympic, not only because of the repair costs and the 2 months the Olympic was out of service, but also because they were found liable for the damage to the HMS Hawke and had to pay for their repairs also. Despite the large financial losses for White Star Line, it wasn't all bad news for them. The incident was an accidental PR stunt, which seemed to prove their claims of the unsinkable design of their Olympic-class vessels. Fast forward to April 10th, 1912, and Violet, still a stewardess for White Star Line, found herself aboard the HMS Olympic's younger sister, the Titanic. Improving on the previous design, this new ship took the title of the world's largest and most luxurious vessel. Many of the Titanic's passengers felt lucky or excited to be on board such an incredible ship and to be part of its maiden voyage. As many of you may know, these romantic feelings of excitement and adventure turned to terror and chaos 4 days later, when the infamous collision with an iceberg led to catastrophic damage to the ship, flooding 6 of the 16 compartments designed to keep the ship afloat. Violet's role was now to keep calm, instruct passengers what to do, and assist in the evacuation of the ship. She was later ordered onto a lifeboat, and just as it was being lowered, one of the ship's officers thrust a baby into her arms. Escaping on one of the few lifeboats available, she and the other survivors of the tragedy were rescued the following morning by RMS Carpathia. Although 710 people had been saved from an ice-cold watery grave, the disaster was responsible for the tragic demise of over 1,500 people. 4.5 years later, the First World War was in its 3rd year. and Violet was once more at sea, clearly not having been put off by her previous 2 experiences. This time she was serving as a voluntary aid detachment nurse on a vessel called the Titanic, which had been converted into a hospital ship to help with the war efforts. On the morning of the 21st of November 1916, the Titanic was sailing off the coast of the Greek island of Kea when she collided with a German mine. The explosion led to 6 compartments of the ship flooding, which, after the lessons learned from the Titanic, would not have been enough to sink the ship. Unfortunately, against orders, many of the portholes on the front lower decks had been left open to ventilate the wards. Due to the flooding, these portholes soon dipped below the water's surface and caused the ship to fill up further, sealing the Titanic's fate. Thankfully, there weren't any patients on board at the time, and there were plenty of lifeboats to go around, but Violet's problems weren't over once her lifeboat reached the water. This is actually where things took a dramatic turn for the worse. The propeller of the ship had started sucking in debris and mincing it all up, including lifeboats and their occupants. People were throwing themselves from the lifeboats and into the water to escape from the pull of the furiously whirling blade. It's at this point in her memoir, Titanic Survivor, that Violet reveals she had a lifelong fear of drowning and had never learned to swim, which I found interesting given her career at sea and now the predicament she found herself in. Survival mode kicked in, and she threw herself out of the boat without another thought, plunging deep into the sea. Unbelievably, it was the first time she'd ever been under the water, but she instinctively closed her eyes tight and held her breath while feeling the weight of her clothes pull her down. Violet had never considered she would actually end up in the water, and had put her life jacket over her large coat instead of under, against the common advice. While under the water, she was thrown about and banged her head badly a couple of times against what was probably the underside, or hull of the ship, before miraculously managing to break above the water's surface. As quickly as she opened her eyes to see, she shut them again, to block out the view of absolute carnage that wouldn't be out of place in a horror movie. The memoir is quite graphic here, and she doesn't hold back on the details. Clutching onto another life jacket that had floated by unoccupied, Violet was eventually found and rescued. Her leg was badly torn and gashed down to the bone. Although it's not explicitly stated in her book, I wonder if she had a close encounter with the propeller to cause such a wound, the motion of which threw her about and caused her to bang her head on the hull. Many years later, she discovered that her skull had actually been fractured by the impact. Regardless, Violet was alive and well and made a full recovery from her injuries, and despite her previous experiences, continued to work at sea until her retirement in 1950, living in Suffolk, England, to the ripe old age of 83. Some may say she was incredibly unlucky, even cursed, to have had such a hard life and experienced such tragedies. Others would argue that she was charmed with incredible luck to get through it all. I would have to say she was simply a victim of circumstance, and a child of much harder times. It was these harsh early years that helped forge the steel of her character, and made her what she really was, a survivor.